Lieutenant Rowan Hayes stood at attention in the pristine docking bay of Earth's orbital station Aurora, trying not to fidget with his uniform collar. The approaching vessel carried humanity's first Syntaxian diplomatic representative, and everything had to be perfect. The Syntaxians were known throughout the galaxy for their precise social structures and adherence to logic above all else. The ship's docking procedure was a masterpiece of efficiency, not a single wasted movement as it connected with the station's airlock. As the pressure equalized with a soft hiss, Rowan mentally reviewed the first contact protocols one last time. The doors slid open to reveal a tall, willowy figure with iridescent scales that seemed to shift between shades of blue and silver. "Welcome to Aurora Station," Rowan said, executing a perfect diplomatic bow. "I'm Lieutenant Rowan Hayes, your liaison during your stay with us. Please, after you, Ambassador Viwexera." The Syntaxian didn't move. Instead, their head tilted at an angle that reminded Rowan of a curious bird. The universal translator at their throat pulsed with a soft light as they spoke. "I do not understand. You wish me to proceed first into unknown territory?" Rowan hesitated, suddenly unsure. It's a human custom. A sign of respect and courtesy." "Fascinating." Viwexera's scales rippled with what Rowan would later learn was their equivalent of raised eyebrows. In Syntaxian protocol, the highest-ranking official always enters last, to ensure the safety of those in their charge. To do otherwise would be considered negligent. "I assure you, Ambassador, our station is completely safe," Rowan said, though he remained rooted in place, not wanting to violate their customs. "Your species deliberately places those you wish to honor in potentially vulnerable positions?" Viwexera's scales shifted to a deep purple hue. "This requires further study. Please, Lieutenant Hayes, proceed first, as per our protocols. I wish to understand how your species has survived with such interesting customs." As they walked through the station's corridors, Viwexera's questions came in rapid succession. Why did humans hold doors for others? Why did they give up seats to certain individuals? Each answer seemed to both fascinate and perplex the ambassador further. "Your entire social structure seems built on voluntary vulnerability," Viwexera observed as they approached the diplomatic quarters. "It appears highly inefficient. We find that showing consideration for others actually strengthens our communities," Rowan explained. "It builds trust and cooperation." "Trust?" Viwexera's scales flickered with interest. "We Syntaxians base our interactions on proven reliability and established hierarchies. Trust is considered too variable for diplomatic relations." Before Rowan could respond, the station's artificial gravity fluctuated briefly, a common occurrence during routine maintenance. Without thinking, he reached out to steady Viwexera when they stumbled slightly. The ambassador froze, scales shifting rapidly through various colors. "You assisted me," they stated, their translator struggling to convey their tone. "Without calculating the benefit to yourself or consulting proper protocols." "It's instinct," Rowan explained, quickly withdrawing his hand. "Sorry if I overstepped." "Instinct," Viwexera repeated, as if testing the word. "Your species relies on unplanned responses to ensure the welfare of others? Even potential rivals or unknown entities? Sometimes the best decisions come from the heart rather than the head," Rowan said, immediately regretting using such an idiom with a being who might take it literally. But Viwexera surprised him. "An organ making decisions? Ah, this is what humans call a metaphor. We have studied these in your transmissions." Their scales settled into a calm blue shade. "Lieutenant Hayes, I believe my stay here will be most educational. Though I must warn you, my report to the Syntaxian High Council about human customs may cause quite a stir." "I hope that's a good thing," Rowan said with a slight smile. "Good? Bad? These are subjective measurements. Let us say instead that it will be interesting." Viwexera paused at the door to their quarters. Though I must ask, will you insist on this ladies first custom during all our interactions? Only if you're comfortable with it. We can adapt our customs to respect your preferences. Viwaxera's scales shimmered with what Rowan would come to recognize as their version of thoughtful consideration. Perhaps we could alternate? For scientific observation, of course. To understand the psychological effects of both protocols. Of course, Rowan agreed, managing to keep a straight face. Purely for scientific purposes. As Viwaxera finally entered their quarters first, Syntaxian protocol taking precedence for the moment, they turned back to Rowan. Lieutenant, I believe humans have a saying about small steps leading to greater journeys? One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind? No, though that is equally applicable. I was thinking of every journey begins with a single step. Today, we have taken that step, even if we cannot yet agree on who should go first. As Rowan headed back to his duties, he couldn't help but smile. First contact situations were never simple, but something told him this particular cultural exchange was going to be more interesting than anyone had anticipated. 3 weeks into Ambassador Viwaxera's stay on Aurora Station, Lieutenant Rowan Hayes found himself explaining yet another human custom in the station's hydroponic garden. The ambassador's scales shifted through shades of confusion as they watched a young engineer offer her seat to an elderly scientist. This hierarchy based on age variance, Viwaxera said, making notes on their data pad, it seems arbitrary. The younger human was clearly engaged in important calculations. Their efficiency has now been reduced by 12.3%. It's not about efficiency, Rowan explained, watching the elderly scientist thank the engineer with a warm smile. It's about showing respect and making others comfortable. Comfort, Viwaxera's scales rippled with what Rowan now recognized as their equivalent of a sigh. Your species seems obsessed with this concept. Just yesterday, I observed Commander Bennett apologizing to a maintenance technician for bumping into them. The commander outranks them by several levels. Rank doesn't exempt us from courtesy, Rowan said, leading them toward the garden's central atrium. If anything, being in a position of authority means we should be more mindful of how we treat others. Viwaxera stopped abruptly, their scales shifting to a deep indigo, a color Rowan hadn't seen before. This contradicts everything in Syntaxian society. Our entire structure is based on the principle that authority grants privileges. To suggest that it instead grants obligations? They made another note. The High Council will find this most disturbing. A group of off-duty crew members passed by, some nodding respectfully to the ambassador. Viwaxera's scales flickered rapidly as they attempted to return each gesture with precise Syntaxian formality, resulting in what looked like an elaborate dance. You need not acknowledge every greeting, Rowan suggested gently. A simple nod will suffice. But their ranks must be calculated, their status assessed, the proper response calibrated. Viwaxera's voice trailed off as they noticed Rowan trying to hide a smile. You are amused by my confusion? Not at all, Rowan assured them quickly. I'm just remembering my first diplomatic assignment. I spent hours memorizing proper protocols, only to discover that sometimes the best approach is simply to be genuine. Genuine? Viwaxera tested the word. To act without calculation? Without considering all variables and potential outcomes? Their scales shifted to a pale yellow that Rowan associated with anxiety. How do you prevent social chaos? Before Rowan could respond, the garden sprinkler system activated unexpectedly. Without thinking, he stepped forward to shield Viwaxera from the spray, knowing that Syntaxians were sensitive to sudden environmental changes. Lieutenant Hayes. Viwaxera's scales flashed with alarm. You are allowing yourself to become saturated to prevent my discomfort. It's fine, Rowan said, already dripping. It's just water. Are you all right? Viwaxera's scales cycled through several colors before settling on a peculiar mixture of blue and gold. You acted without protocol, without hesitation, to ensure my comfort. Yet again, your species confounds logical analysis. As the sprinklers shut off, Rowan ran a hand through his wet hair, considering how to explain. Sometimes caring for others means acting on instinct rather than logic. It's not about calculating the perfect response, it's about showing others that their well-being matters to us. But how do you determine whose well-being takes precedence? Viwaxera asked, helping Rowan wring out his uniform sleeve in a gesture that seemed unconsciously cooperative. In Syntaxian society, every interaction is governed by clear hierarchies. There is never any doubt about proper procedure. And yet, Rowan observed carefully, you just helped me with my sleeve without consulting any protocols. Viwaxera's scales flashed with surprise as they realized what they'd done. They stared at their hands as if they belonged to someone else. I did. How peculiar. Perhaps your human customs are infectious? Or perhaps, Rowan suggested, there's something natural about wanting to help others, regardless of our species or social structures. Natural? Viwaxera's scales showed skepticism. There is nothing natural about compromising one's own comfort for another's benefit. It defies evolutionary logic. They paused, head tilting. And yet, your species has not only survived but thrived while practicing such behaviors. This suggests a variable we Syntaxians have failed to consider in our social equations. As they continued their walk through the garden, now slightly damper than planned, Viwaxera continued making notes. Lieutenant, I have a hypothesis I wish to test. Would you be willing to assist me in an experiment? What kind of experiment? I wish to attempt performing human courtesies without calculating their logical merit. To act, as you say, from the heart rather than from protocol. For scientific purposes, of course. Of course, Rowan agreed, hiding another smile. Though I should warn you, human courtesy can be quite unpredictable. Unpredictable, Viwaxera's scales shimmered with what might have been excitement, though they would never admit to such an emotional response. Yes, I'm beginning to understand that this is precisely what makes it so intriguing. Though please do not include that last observation in your official report. The High Council is already concerned that I'm becoming too interested in human ways. As they reached the garden's exit, both Rowan and Viwaxera paused, looking at each other expectantly. After you, they said simultaneously. For a moment, neither moved. Then, to Rowan's astonishment, Viwaxera's scales rippled with what could only be described as laughter. Perhaps, they said, we should proceed together. For efficiency's sake, of course. Of course, Rowan agreed. Purely logical. But as they walked through the door side by side, he couldn't help noticing that Viwaxera's scales had settled into a new pattern, one that seemed to combine all the colors they displayed so far, creating something entirely new. Something that looked remarkably like change. The alert sirens on Aurora Station pierced through the quiet of Gamma Shift, startling Lieutenant Rowan Hayes from his review of diplomatic reports. Red warning lights pulsed through the corridors as he rushed toward the command center, nearly colliding with Ambassador Viwaxera who was hurrying from the opposite direction. A Level 1 containment breach in the quantum physics lab, Viwaxera reported, their scales a sharp mix of urgent red and focused silver. I was observing their experiments when the containment field began to destabilize. They reached the command center together, where Commander Bennett was already coordinating the emergency response. The main display showed a growing distortion in the quantum field surrounding the lab, threatening to tear a hole in the fabric of spacetime. The containment algorithms aren't responding, reported Dr. Patel, her fingers flying over the control panel. The quantum fluctuations are too chaotic for our standard protocols. Syntaxian quantum mathematics might help, Viwaxera offered, scales shifting to deep purple with concentration. Though I must warn you, sharing such advanced calculations with non-Syntaxians violates several high-level protocols. With all due respect to your protocols, Ambassador, Rowan said, watching the distortion grow, we have 10 minutes before that breach tears this station apart. Viwaxera's scales flickered through several colors before settling on a determined blue. You are correct, Lieutenant. Protocols must sometimes yield to necessity. They moved to the control panel, their long fingers dancing across the interface. Your containment field is too rigid, too focused on perfect stability. Quantum energy requires flexibility. Flexibility isn't exactly a syntaxian trait, Rowan observed, earning a ripple of color across Viwaxera's scales that might have been amusement despite the crisis. Perhaps I have learned something from studying human customs, they replied, never taking their eyes off the calculations. Sometimes the most stable path is one that allows for adaptation. The next few minutes were a blur of activity as Viwaxera guided the human engineers through a series of quantum adjustments. Their traditional syntaxian precision combined with human intuition in ways that surprised everyone, especially Viwaxera. There! Dr. Patel exclaimed. The field is stabilizing, but... She hesitated, looking at her readings with concern. We need to manually reset the quantum matrix. Someone has to go into the lab. The radiation levels are beyond safe limits for humans, Commander Bennett stated grimly. Even with protective gear. I will go, Viwaxera said immediately, their scales showing no hint of hesitation. Syntaxian physiology is more resistant to quantum radiation. Not alone, Rowan stepped forward. You'll need someone to watch your back while you work. Lieutenant Hayes, Viwaxera's scales shifted to a concerned purple. This is not a matter of human courtesy. The radiation will cause you significant harm. It's not about courtesy, Rowan replied, already moving toward the emergency gear storage. It's about not letting friends face danger alone. Friends? Viwaxera's scales flickered with surprise. We have no formal alliance agreement, no documented relationship protocol. Sometimes, Rowan said, checking his radiation suit, the strongest bonds aren't the ones written in protocols. As they approached the lab's sealed doors, Viwaxera paused. Lieutenant. Rowan. Your human customs continue to challenge my understanding. You would risk your well-being for someone who is, technically, a diplomatic rival? That's kind of the point of all those customs you've been studying, Rowan said, running final checks on their equipment. They're not just formalities, they're how we show that we value each other above protocols and politics. The lab doors opened with a hiss of decontamination spray. The quantum distortion filled the room with shifting patterns of energy that made Rowan's eyes water even through his protective visor. Viwaxera moved with precise efficiency toward the quantum matrix, their scales visible through their specialized suit cycling through focused patterns of blue and silver. The radiation is affecting your suit's integrity, they noted, concern evident even through the translator. You should withdraw to a safe distance. Not happening, Rowan said, holding steady as he monitored the approaching energy waves. Just focus on the matrix. I'll watch our backs. Working together, they managed to reach the control panel. Viwaxera's fingers moved in complex patterns as they initiated the reset sequence, while Rowan kept track of the fluctuating energy patterns that threatened to overwhelm them. Your presence here is highly illogical, Viwaxera commented as they worked, their scales showing a complex pattern Rowan had never seen before. Yet. I find myself grateful for it. That's another human custom, Rowan said, fighting back a wave of dizziness from the radiation. Standing by each other, even when it's illogical. The quantum matrix pulsed with new energy as Viwaxera's adjustments took effect. The distortion began to stabilize, the threatening tear in spacetime slowly healing itself. But as they turned to leave, a surge of energy knocked Rowan off his feet, his suit's integrity finally failing. Without hesitation, Viwaxera scooped him up, their superior syntaxian strength making it look effortless. Now it is my turn to defy logic, they said, their scales showing a fierce protective pattern as they carried him to safety. Later, in the medical bay, Rowan awoke to find Viwexera standing by his bed, their scales shifting through worried colors. The doctor assures me you will recover fully, they said. Though your actions were incredibly reckless by any species standards. Says the one who carried me through a quantum radiation field, Rowan countered weakly. Yes, well, Viwexera's scales showed what might have been embarrassment. I have submitted my report to the High Council about today's events. I may have neglected to mention certain, illogical actions on my part. Keeping secrets from your superiors, Ambassador? How very human of you. Perhaps, Viwexera admitted, their scales settling into that new, complex pattern again, some human customs are worth adopting. Though I would appreciate if you did not include that observation in your official report either. As Rowan drifted back to sleep, he could have sworn he saw Viwexera's scales shift into a pattern that looked remarkably like a smile. It seemed that near-death experiences, like human courtesy, had a way of breaking down barriers between species. 2 weeks after the Quantum Lab incident, Aurora Station buzzed with unprecedented activity. The Syntaxian High Council, intrigued by Viwexera's reports of human-Syntaxian cooperation, had dispatched a delegation to observe this cultural phenomenon firsthand. Lieutenant Rowan Hayes, finally cleared for duty by medical, found Ambassador Viwexera in the observation dome, their scales shifting through anxious patterns as they watched the approaching Syntaxian vessel. The High Council's first speaker is aboard that ship, Viwexera said, their translator barely catching the tremor in their voice. No first speaker has ever left Syntaxian space before. I take it that's significant, Rowan said, standing beside them at the viewport. Significant? Viwexera's scales flickered with what Rowan now recognized as nervous amusement. Lieutenant, you don't understand. My reports about human customs, about courtesy and adaptation and putting others first, they've caused quite a stir. Some council members believe I've been contaminated by human ideals. Others are fascinated by the potential implications for our society. And the first speaker? Is here to judge for himself. Viwexera turned to face Rowan, their scales showing a complex pattern of determination and concern. Everything we've learned from each other, everything we've built, it will all be tested today. The Syntaxian delegation's arrival was a masterpiece of ceremonial precision. The first speaker, a towering figure with scales that seemed to contain every color imaginable, emerged from their ship with an entourage of advisors. Rowan noticed how they arranged themselves in perfect hierarchical order, each member exactly 3 steps behind their superior. First speaker, Viwexera greeted, executing a flawless Syntaxian formal bow. Aurora Station welcomes you. The first speaker's scales shifted through several evaluative patterns as they observed the human greeting party. Ambassador Viwexera, your reports have caused considerable discussion in the council. This human concept of courtesy, of deliberately placing oneself at a disadvantage to benefit others, it challenges everything we believe about social efficiency. With respect, first speaker, Viwexera replied, their scales showing more confidence than Rowan had ever seen, I have come to believe that what appears inefficient in theory often proves invaluable in practice. Demonstrate, the first speaker commanded. Over the next several hours, Viwexera led the delegation through the station, with Rowan at their side. They showed how humans and Syntaxians had begun working together in the labs, combining Syntaxian precision with human intuition. They explained how the Quantum Lab incident had been resolved through cooperation rather than rigid adherence to protocol. Fascinating, the first speaker observed, watching a human engineer assist a Syntaxian scientist with an experiment, neither caring about rank or protocol. But surely this informality leads to chaos? Actually, Rowan interjected, careful to follow Syntaxian diplomatic protocols, we've found that allowing people to help each other naturally often leads to stronger bonds and better results than forcing them to follow strict rules. The first speaker's scales shifted to a curious pattern. "You speak of bonds, Lieutenant Hayes." Ambassador Viwaxera's reports mentioned this concept repeatedly. "We syntaxians have always believed that professional distance maintains optimal efficiency. Yet your station's productivity has increased by 23% since beginning this cultural exchange. Sometimes the most efficient path isn't the most obvious one," Viwaxera said, their scales showing a blend of human and syntaxian communication patterns that made Rowan smile. Just as the quantum field required flexibility to stabilize, perhaps societies benefit from allowing space for adaptation and genuine connection. As they reached the station's newly completed Cultural Exchange Center, a space that blended syntaxian geometric precision with human organic design, the first speaker stopped abruptly. Their scales shifted through several contemplative patterns before settling on a color Rowan had never seen before. "Ambassador Viwaxera," they said finally, "the council sent me here expecting to find evidence that you had been compromised by human influence. Instead, I find myself wondering if perhaps it is our rigid adherence to protocol that has compromised our potential." First speaker. Viwaxera's scales showed surprise and hope intermingled. "Your experiment in cultural adaptation will continue, with the Council's full support. Moreover, we wish to expand these exchanges to other human stations. Perhaps." Their scales shifted to show amusement, "We might even learn to go first through doors occasionally." Later, in the station's garden, which now featured both earth plants and syntaxian crystal formations, Rowan found Viwaxera standing among the hybrid blooms their scientists had created together. "Your scales are showing a new pattern," he observed. "I don't think I've seen that one before." "It is not one I have experienced before," Viwaxera admitted. "The closest translation might be, contentment mixed with anticipation. The first speaker's decision will change both our societies, Rowan. Change can be scary," he suggested. "I was going to say logistically complex, but yes, scary is also accurate." Their scales rippled with what was definitely amusement now. "Though I find myself looking forward to it. Perhaps that is the most significant change of all. The fact that you're excited about change? The fact that I no longer feel the need to justify my emotional responses with logical explanations." Viwaxera turned to face him. "Your human customs have taught me that sometimes the most valuable protocols are the ones we create ourselves, through experience and genuine connection." As if to demonstrate, they held out their hand in the human gesture of friendship they had observed so often. Rowan took it, noting how their scales shifted to show warmth and trust, emotions that would have been considered highly inappropriate for a syntaxian diplomat just months ago. "Though I must insist," Viwaxera added, their scales showing playful patterns, "that we maintain some protocols. The universe might not be ready for completely informal syntaxians." "Baby steps," Rowan agreed with a laugh. "Or should I say, logical incremental progress?" "Perhaps," Viwaxera suggested, their scales now showing that unique pattern that seemed to represent their own personal blend of human and syntaxian traits, "we could simply call it growing together." 6 months after the first speaker's visit, Aurora Station had become the model for human syntaxian cooperation across the galaxy. The station's main gathering hall buzzed with activity as both species prepared for an unprecedented event, the first official celebration combining human and syntaxian traditions. Lieutenant Rowan Hayes watched with amusement as Ambassador Viwaxera attempted to hang decorations while simultaneously calculating their optimal geometric arrangement. "You know," Rowan said, holding the ladder steady, "sometimes decorations can just be pretty without being mathematically perfect." Viwaxera's scales shifted through patterns of mock offense. "I'll have you know this arrangement optimizes both aesthetic appeal and symbolic significance. Though," they added, their scales showing a hint of mischief, "I may have deliberately placed that last crystal 2 degrees off-center, just to see if anyone notices." Ambassador Viwaxera breaking symmetry on purpose? The High Council would be scandalized. "The High Council," Viwaxera replied, descending the ladder with characteristic grace, is too busy studying the effects of human-style courtesy on diplomatic relations to worry about my minor acts of rebellion. Did you know they're actually considering implementing a ladies first protocol in certain situations? The universe must be ending, Rowan laughed. Next you'll tell me Syntaxians are learning to smile. We do not smile, Viwexera protested, though their scales rippled with colors that conveyed the same emotion. We simply allow our scales to express appropriate satisfaction with pleasant circumstances. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of newly appointed Cultural Exchange Officer Dr. Patel, who had helped them during the quantum lab crisis. The first guests are arriving, she announced. Including 3 members of the Syntaxian Science Council and, this is unexpected, a group of Arcturian diplomats. Arcturians? Viwexera's scales showed surprise. They've been reluctant to engage with either of our species. Why would they? Word has spread, Rowan explained. What we've built here, this blend of structure and flexibility, protocol and adaptation, it's attracting attention from across the galaxy. The celebration that followed was unlike anything either species had ever experienced. Syntaxian precision dancing merged with human freestyle movement. Traditional Earth music played through crystal harmonics devices, creating sounds that seemed to bridge the gap between mathematical perfection and emotional expression. Even the food represented this fusion, with Earth delicacies arranged in precise Syntaxian patterns. The Arcturian diplomats watched it all with their characteristic floating eye stalks swaying in what seemed to be approval. Most illuminating, their chief representative commented. We had believed that species so different in their fundamental approaches to social interaction could never truly cooperate. Yet here we observe harmony emerging from contrast. That's exactly what we've learned, Rowan said, exchanging a glance with Viwexera. Sometimes the greatest strength comes from embracing our differences rather than trying to eliminate them. Indeed, Viwexera agreed, their scales showing that unique pattern that had become their signature, a blend of Syntaxian precision and human warmth. Though I must admit, it took nearly being absorbed by a quantum anomaly for me to fully appreciate that lesson. As the evening progressed, Rowan found himself at the observation dome with Viwexera, watching ships from all 3 species moving in coordinated patterns around the station. Did you ever imagine, he asked, when you first arrived and I tried to let you go first through that airlock, that we'd end up here? Never, Viwexera admitted, their scales showing thoughtful patterns. In fact, I had calculated a 73.2% probability that human customs would prove too chaotic for meaningful diplomatic relations. They paused, scales shifting to show amusement. I have never been more pleased to be proven wrong by statistical improbability. Speaking of human customs, Rowan said, we have a tradition of making toasts at celebrations, speaking to our hopes for the future. Would you like to try it? A spontaneous verbal expression of aspirational thoughts? Viwexera's scales showed playful consideration. How charmingly inefficient. I accept. Rowan raised his glass. To breaking protocols and building bridges. Viwexera raised their own glass with perfect Syntaxian precision, then deliberately tilted it slightly off-angle, earning a grin from Rowan. To the wisdom of going first, even when logic suggests otherwise. As they stood together watching the stars, a group of mixed human and Syntaxian children, part of the station's new exchange program, ran past the dome's entrance. They were playing some hybrid game that seemed to combine Syntaxian mathematical principles with human tag, their laughter and color-shifting scales creating a symphony of joy. They don't see differences to overcome, Rowan observed. They just see new ways to play together. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson we could have learned, Viwexera replied, their scales showing that perfect blend of logic and emotion they had developed. That the universe is not divided into those who go first and those who follow, but rather filled with opportunities to move forward together. As if to demonstrate, they both stepped toward the door at the same time, then stopped, sharing a moment of understanding. Without a word, they walked through side by side, no longer bound by the protocols of who should go first, but instead embracing the simple joy of sharing the journey. Behind them, Earth's sun painted the observation dome in brilliant colors, its light refracting through syntaxian crystals to create patterns that were neither purely mathematical nor purely artistic, but something new and beautiful, much like the future they were building together, one small step at a time.